Alistair, please, be gentle. You're hurting me. The whisper was a fragile thing, a wisp of sound lost against the heavy silk of the bedsheets and the rhythmic, labored breathing of the man on top of her. His weight was immense, a crushing presence that seemed to press all the air from her lungs, all the life from her spirit. This wasn't passion, it was a transaction, a debt being collected in the dead of night. Each thrust was a reminder of her contract, each grunt a confirmation of her sale. She closed her eyes, her long lashes wet against her cheeks, and endured it, just as she endured the lavish dinners where she was paraded like a prize, and the cold mornings where she woke up alone in a bed that felt as vast and empty as an Arctic plain. His final, shuddering release was a mercy, and the silence that followed, broken only by his immediate, guttural snores, was her true salvation. She slid out from under his slack arm, her movements slow and silent, a ghost in her own bedroom. The marble floor of the ensuite bathroom was cold against her bare feet, a welcome shock that grounded her in the suffocating opulence of her reality. She stared at the woman in the gilded mirror, a pale figure draped in a see-through silk chemise he had bought for her. The woman had her face, her honey blonde hair spilling over her shoulders, her sad green eyes that seemed to hold the reflection of a life she no longer recognized. This was Mrs. Alara Finch, the beautiful young wife of the tycoon Alistair Finch, a woman envied by many but understood by none. She touched the faint bruise forming on her collarbone, a small, ugly mark of ownership. She was here because her father, a good man with bad luck, had made a deal with this devil to save his company, to save their family from ruin, and she, Alara, was the final, most precious payment. This sprawling Connecticut mansion, with its manicured gardens and silent hallways, wasn't a home. It was a gilded cage, and the man snoring in the next room, old enough to be her grandfather, was not her husband, he was her keeper. The morning light was a pale, sterile thing in Connecticut, filtering through windows so vast and clean they seemed like invisible walls between Alara and the world. She woke, as she always did, to the oppressive silence of the master suite. The space Alistair had occupied beside her was already cold, the sheets turned down with a precision that suggested he hadn't slept so much as temporarily ceased activity. He was an early riser, a man who treated the dawn as a business competitor to be conquered before it had fully arrived. Her first moments of consciousness were always the heaviest, a brief, blissful amnesia, followed by the crushing weight of remembrance. She was Mrs. Finch. She was property. A silent, uniformed maid named Maria would enter at precisely 7:30, not with a gentle knock, but with the soft, determined click of the door handle. She never spoke beyond a formal, "Good morning, madam," her eyes always averted, as if looking directly at Alara was a breach of protocol. On the velvet chaise lounge, her outfit for the day would be laid out. Today, it was a cream-colored cashmere dress with a modest neckline and a belt that would cinch her waist just so. It was beautiful, elegant, and utterly devoid of personality. It was the uniform of a statue, not the choice of a living woman. Alara would wear it, just as she wore all the others. To resist was pointless. It only resulted in cold, clipped lectures from Alistair about appreciating the lifestyle he provided. Breakfast was a lonely ritual in a dining room that could have hosted a state dinner. The mahogany table, polished to a mirror shine, stretched for what felt like miles. A single-place setting was laid out for her at one end, a small island in a sea of wood. She would eat her grapefruit, meticulously sectioned by the chef, and sip tea from a porcelain cup so delicate she feared it would shatter in her grasp. The only sound was the solemn ticking of a grandfather clock in the hall, each tick a second of her youth draining away, each chime of the hour a bell tolling for the person she used to be. She remembered breakfasts from her other life, the one before the contract was signed. Crowded, noisy diner booths with her college friends, laughing over greasy bacon and burnt coffee. Reading a paperback novel propped against a sugar dispenser, her mind free to roam. Here, her reading was monitored. Alistair curated a small collection of books for her biographies of powerful men, histories of art auctions, and classical literature he deemed appropriate. Anything modern, anything with a hint of passion or rebellion, was considered frivolous. The mansion itself was her warden. It was a masterpiece of architecture and interior design, filled with priceless art and antique furniture, but it had no warmth. The hallways were long and echoing, the vast rooms filled with a chilling stillness. Alara would often wander through them, a ghost in her own home, her soft-soled shoes making no sound on the thick oriental rugs. She would trace the intricate carvings on a centuries-old cabinet or stare at a landscape painting of a place she would never see. It all felt like a museum, and she was the most recent, most fragile exhibit. Alistair's presence, even when he wasn't there, was suffocating. His rules were unspoken but absolute. His preferences became her reality. He liked the scent of gardenias, so every room had a fresh bouquet, their cloying sweetness a constant, sickening perfume. He preferred her hair in an elegant chignon, arguing that it exposed the delicate line of her neck, an asset he was particularly proud of. Before the social events that were the primary function of her existence, he would inspect her like a general reviewing a soldier. He would adjust a diamond earring, smooth a non-existent crease on her gown, his touch impersonal and proprietary. "Stand up straight, Alara," he'd command softly, his voice a low rumble. "When you walk into a room, you represent me. Your beauty is a reflection of my success." He never said she was beautiful for her own sake. Her beauty was a tool, an asset listed on his personal balance sheet. He would praise her body in the same way he would praise a well-restored classic car, commenting on its lines, its form, its value. He would run a dry, papery hand over the curve of her hip in a silk dress and murmur his approval, not of her, but of the aesthetic she presented. She was his perfect doll, dressed and posed to his exact specifications. This constant objectification was chipping away at her soul. She would look in the mirror and see the shell Alistair had created. A poised, elegant woman with a serene, empty smile. But inside, she was screaming. Inside, she was a two-year-old girl who wanted to wear jeans and a messy bun, who wanted to listen to loud music and make mistakes, who wanted to fall in love for real. The loneliness was a physical ache, a cold hollow in the center of her chest that no cashmere sweater could warm. She had no friends here. The wives of Alistair's associates looked at her with a mixture of envy and pity, their conversations as shallow and polished as the marble floors. She spoke to her parents once a week, on a scheduled call that felt rehearsed. She would tell them she was fine, that Alistair was a good man, and she could hear the relief in her father's voice, a relief so profound it only sharpened the edges of her own misery. He was free, but she was paying the price every single day. One afternoon, she stood by the massive bay window in the drawing room looking out at the gardens. Every hedge was trimmed into a perfect, unnatural shape. Every flower bed was a riot of color, but arranged with a geometric precision that felt lifeless. Beyond the gardens, a high stone wall encircled the entire estate, separating her from the messy, vibrant, unpredictable world outside. A hawk circled high overhead, its wings spread wide against the blue sky. It was wild, untamed, and free. A single, hot tear traced a path down her cheek as she watched it disappear over the wall. She felt a desperate, primal yearning to follow it, to shatter the perfect glass of her cage and simply fly away. But the glass was too thick, and her own wings, she feared, had long since been broken. The change came on a Tuesday, a day no different from any other. The sky was a flat, indifferent gray, and Alara was seeking refuge in the one room she both loved and hated, the library. It was Alistair's pride, a two-story cathedral of literature, with shelves of leather-bound books reaching up to a coffered ceiling. It smelled of old paper and beeswax, a scent she found comforting. Yet, it was also a symbol of her confinement. These books were full of worlds she couldn't enter, passions she couldn't feel. She was running her fingers along a row of Charles Dickens novels, not reading, just touching something real from a different time, when a sound from the main hall broke the mausoleum's silence. It wasn't the measured, heavy footstep of Alistair, nor the deferential shuffle of the staff. It was a lighter, more energetic sound, accompanied by a voice young, male, and unfamiliar, exchanging a casual greeting with the butler. Alara froze, her hand hovering over a copy of Great Expectations. Visitors were rare and always pre-approved by Alistair. Unannounced guests were simply not a possibility in this meticulously controlled universe. The library doors swung open, and he stood there. For a moment, her breath caught in her throat. He wasn't like anyone she had seen in months. He seemed to bring the air of the outside world in with him. It clung to his clothes, to his very presence. He was tall and lean, with an artist's build, dressed in dark jeans and a simple gray Henley shirt, the sleeves pushed up to his forearms. His hair was a chaotic tumble of black curls that fell across his brow, and he carried a worn leather satchel slung over one shoulder. He looked utterly, beautifully out of place. He paused in the doorway, his eyes adjusting to the dim light, and then they found her. Alara felt a jolt, a strange and forgotten sensation. The men she met now, Alistair's associates, all looked at her with the same appraising glaze, a mixture of financial calculation and veiled lust. But this man's eyes were different. They were a deep, intelligent brown, and they weren't just looking at her, they were seeing her. They saw the expensive dress, yes, but they also seemed to see the girl lost inside it, the flicker of surprise and fear in her expression. A slow, slightly crooked smile spread across his lips. "Whoops, sorry to intrude," he said, his voice warmer and richer than she'd expected. "I was told the old man was out. I should have known the dragon's lair is never truly unguarded." Alara found her voice, though it came out as a quiet, formal murmur. "Mr. Finch is at his office in the city. May I help you?" He took a step into the room, letting the heavy door swing shut behind him and closing them in the quiet space. "Julian," he said, extending a hand. "Julian Finch. I'm the grandson. The prodigal one, according to grandfather's last letter." Alara hesitated for a second before placing her hand in his. His grip was warm and firm, his skin slightly calloused. It felt real, human, a startling contrast to Alistair's dry, possessive touch. "Alara," she replied, withdrawing her hand quickly. "It's a pleasure to meet you." "Alara," he repeated, testing the name on his tongue. "It's a beautiful name. It doesn't quite fit the whole Mrs. Finch vibe, does it?" His directness was disarming. She felt a faint blush rise to her cheeks, a physiological reaction she thought had atrophied from disuse. I'm not sure what you mean." Julian laughed, a soft, genuine sound that seemed to chase some of the shadows from the corners of the room. "Don't mind me. I have a bad habit of saying what I think. I've just gotten back from a few years in Florence. I'm used to a little more chaos." He gestured around the pristine, silent library. "This much order makes my skin crawl. My grandfather's a collector, you know. He collects companies, art, antique furniture." His eyes met hers again, and for a fleeting moment, his smile vanished, replaced by a look of profound understanding. "And beautiful things that he can keep in perfect condition." The unspoken words hung in the air between them. "Like you." He had been in the house for less than 5 minutes, and he already understood her entire existence more than anyone had in nearly a year. Alara felt a dangerous, thrilling flutter in her chest. She should have been offended, should have retreated into the cold persona of Mrs. Finch, but instead, she felt a crack appear in the icy facade she had so carefully constructed. "You're an artist?" she asked, changing the subject, her voice still quiet. "I try to be," he said, shrugging off his satchel and letting it drop to the floor with a soft thud. "A painter. It drives Alistair crazy. He thinks art is something you buy, not something you do. He wanted me to join the family business, to learn how to swallow other companies whole." He roamed over to the window, looking out at the perfectly manicured lawn. "I'd rather starve." His words were a small act of rebellion, a declaration of freedom that resonated deep within her. He was trapped in this world too, in his own way, but he was fighting it. He hadn't surrendered. He turned back to her, leaning against the windowsill. "So, what do you do to stop from going mad in here? Besides dusting the first editions?" Again, that disarming honesty. She felt an almost uncontrollable urge to tell him the truth. "I don't. I'm going mad." But the habit of survival was too strong. "I read," she said simply, gesturing vaguely at the shelves. He raised an eyebrow. "Anything good? Or just the Alistair-approved list of Stoic philosophers and presidential biographies?" A small, involuntary smile touched her lips before she could stop it. "You know your grandfather well." "Unfortunately," Julian said, his own smile returning. "Let me guess. He's hidden all the good stuff. The poetry, the passionate Russian novels, anything with a hint of scandal. He was right, of course. For the first time in so long, Alara didn't feel like an object on display. She felt like a person being seen, being understood. His presence was a vibrant splash of color in her monochromatic life, a sudden, unexpected melody in the crushing silence. The clock in the hall began to chime the hour, and the sound made her flinch, as if she were a child caught doing something wrong. The spell was broken. Reality, with its schedules and its master, was returning. I should let the staff know you've arrived," she stammered, turning to leave. "Hey," Julian said, his voice soft, stopping her. "Alara." She turned back. He was just looking at her, his expression unreadable but gentle. "It was really nice to meet you." The simple, sincere words were like a drop of water on parched land. "You too, Julian," she whispered, and then she fled the room, her heart beating with a wild, terrifying, and hopeful rhythm she had long thought was silenced forever. The house was the same, but everything had changed. A new piece was on the board, and the game had suddenly become infinitely more dangerous. Julian's presence transformed the vast, silent mansion from a tomb into a stage. The oppressive quiet was now charged with a thrilling, terrifying potential. Every corner held the possibility of an encounter. Every echoing footstep in the hall could be his. Alara found herself living in a state of heightened awareness, her senses attuned to the subtle signs of his existence. Her life, once a monotonous, straight line, was now a landscape of peaks and valleys, the peaks being those fleeting, stolen moments they managed to share, and the valleys, the long, empty hours of waiting in between. The dinner table became their primary battlefield of glances. Alistair, oblivious at the head of the table, would hold court, his voice booming as he dissected a corporate acquisition or complained about a political rival. He demanded Alara's placid, attentive gaze, but her eyes had learned a new art. While her face remained a mask of serene interest for her husband, her true attention was a current flowing silently across the polished wood to Julian. He was a master of this silent language. A subtle lift of an eyebrow from him was enough to convey his boredom with his grandfather's monologue. A quick, almost imperceptible wink when Alistair misquoted a philosopher would send a jolt of secret amusement through her. She, in turn, learned to communicate back. A slight tightening of her lips, a brief drop of her gaze to her plate, he could read it all. He could see the despair she fought to hide, the loneliness that clung to her like a shroud. These silent conversations were a lifeline, a shared secret that bound them together against the oblivious tyrant in their midst. Julian began to find reasons to be wherever she was. If she took her morning tea on the stone terrace, he would appear a few minutes later with a sketchbook, settling on a bench nearby. Their conversation would be light, ostensibly for any listening ears. They would talk about the weather, about the impeccable but soulless gardens. Yet, underneath the surface, a deeper dialogue was taking place. He would ask her about the town she grew up in, about the subjects she studied in college. He was excavating the person she was before she became Mrs. Finch, and with every question, she felt a piece of her old self being restored. "My grandfather believes the past should be either embalmed in a museum or bulldozed for a new development," he said one morning, his pencil scratching across the paper. "He doesn't understand that some things are meant to just be remembered." He was looking at his drawing, but she knew he was talking about her. He was the only person who saw her as a person with a past, not just a beautiful object with a price tag. Her first true act of rebellion was born from his words. In the library, he had found her staring longingly at a shelf of modern poetry. "He doesn't approve," she had whispered, as if the books themselves could report back to Alistair. The next day, a slim volume of Mary Oliver's poems appeared, tucked neatly behind a heavy tome on Roman architecture. There was no note. There didn't need to be. That night, long after Alistair's snores began their nightly rhythm, Alara read by the thin beam of her phone's flashlight, huddled under the blankets like a teenager. The words on the page were about nature, about attention, about finding beauty in the small wild things. They were words of freedom, and as she read them, she felt as though Julian were in the room, whispering them to her. Reading that forbidden book was a more intimate act than anything she had ever endured with her husband. The rebellion began to seep into her daily life, small acts of defiance that were invisible to Alistair but shone like beacons to Julian. One evening, as they were preparing to host a small dinner party, Alistair had instructed her to wear a severe emerald green gown. "It makes you look regal," he had stated, a command disguised as a compliment. But earlier that week, Julian had seen her in a simple, cornflower blue sundress and had remarked quietly, "That color, it makes your eyes look like the ocean." So, she chose a different gown from her vast collection, one of a deep sapphire blue. When Alistair questioned her, she simply replied with a cool smile, "I felt the green was a bit funereal for a party, my dear." Alistair, placated by her confident tone, did not argue, but when she descended the grand staircase, her eyes immediately found Julian's across the foyer. The look in them, a mixture of surprise, admiration, and a shared secret delight, was worth more than all the diamonds Alistair had ever draped around her neck. It was her victory, their victory. The psychological craving for his presence became a constant, low hum beneath the surface of her days. She would wake up and her first thought would be, "Will I see him today?" The scent of his charcoal pencils from the library, the sound of his low laugh drifting from the garden, these small things became the anchors of her existence. She began to notice everything about him. The way he pushed his dark hair out of his eyes when he was concentrating. The strength in his hands, so different from Alistair's brittle grasp. The intense focus in his gaze when he listened to her, making her feel as if she were the only person in the world. This growing obsession was terrifying. It was a betrayal, not just of her vows, but of the deal she had made to save her father. Guilt was a constant companion, a shadow that followed her even in her brightest moments with Julian. But the feeling of being truly seen, of being alive, was a drug too powerful to resist. Each stolen glance, each whispered conversation, was a dose that left her feeling euphoric and desperate for more. The tension between them was building, a string pulled tighter and tighter. One afternoon, she was arranging flowers in the West Hall when he approached from behind. "Gardenias," he said, his voice close to her ear. "Alistair's favorite." She jumped slightly, the sharp scent of the flowers suddenly seeming cloying and artificial. "They're a bit overpowering, don't you think?" He continued, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, like a beautiful flower that screams for attention. She turned and found herself standing closer to him than she ever had before. She could feel the warmth radiating from his body, could see the flecks of gold in his dark eyes. The air between them crackled. For a dizzying moment, she thought he might lean in, that his lips might touch hers. Her own lips parted slightly in anticipation. The world narrowed to the few inches of space that separated them. Then, the sound of the grandfather clock chiming in the main hall broke the spell. It was the sound of Alistair's world, of Alistair's rules. They sprang apart, a guilty flush on both their faces. He gave her a tight, knowing smile, and then walked away without another word. Alara stood frozen, her heart hammering against her ribs. Her hand trembled as she reached out to touch a waxy white petal of a gardenia. The string had been pulled taut, and she knew with a terrifying certainty that it was about to snap. The emotional connection she shared with Julian had become the sun in her otherwise starless sky, and she found herself orbiting it constantly. The stolen glances and whispered half-conversations were no longer enough. They had awakened a deeper hunger, a longing for something she couldn't yet name. It was an ache that settled low in her belly, a restlessness that made her pace the silent halls like a caged panther. She found herself drawn to the library more and more, not just for the solace of the books, but because it had become their sanctuary, the one place where they had first truly connected. She would sit in a plush leather armchair, pretending to read, while her entire being was focused on the doorway, waiting, hoping. One overcast afternoon, a deep sense of anxiety gnawed at her. Alistair was in a particularly foul mood, and the oppressive atmosphere in the mansion was thicker than usual. She needed the comfort of the poetry book Julian had given her, the one she now thought of as theirs. She had hidden it for safety on a high shelf, tucked behind a set of dreary encyclopedias that she knew Alistair would never touch. She retrieved the rolling library ladder, the heavy wood gliding silently across the polished floor. The ladder was tall, and as she ascended, she felt a small, dizzying thrill. Reaching the top rungs, she stretched, her body pulling taut, the cashmere of her sweater riding up to expose a sliver of skin at her waist. Her fingers brushed against the spine of the hidden book, a secret treasure. "Need some help with that?" Julian's voice came from below, soft and low, not wanting to startle her. She looked down, her heart giving a sharp, pleasant jolt. He was standing at the base of the ladder, looking up at her, a small, gentle smile on his face. He hadn't been there a moment ago. He moved with a quiet grace that was the complete opposite of Alistair's heavy, deliberate presence. "I'm fine," she said, her voice a little breathless from the climb, and from him. "I've almost got it." But as she tried to work the small book out from its tight hiding place, her grip faltered and it slipped, tumbling through the air. With a movement that was all fluid instinct, Julian reached out and caught it. He looked at the simple cover, then back up at her, his smile widening into a knowing grin. Mary Oliver. A dangerous choice for a Tuesday afternoon. She descended the ladder, her feet finding the floor as her eyes remained locked on his. She felt suddenly shy, exposed in her small act of literary rebellion. "I needed something real," she confessed in a whisper. He nodded, his expression softening with that deep, unnerving understanding that always made her feel so transparent. "I know the feeling." He held the book out to her, and as she reached to take it, it happened. The space between them, which had been charged with unspoken words and lingering glances for weeks, suddenly collapsed into a single, searing point of contact. Her fingers brushed against his as she took the book. It wasn't a fleeting, incidental touch. For a split second, his fingers curled slightly, a warm, firm pressure against hers. It was a spark, a palpable jolt of static electricity, of heat, of life. The air was instantly sucked from her lungs. The world seemed to stop spinning. The only sound was the frantic, terrified drumming of her own heart. She stared at their hands, his tanned and strong, hers pale and trembling, connected by the slim volume of poetry. It felt like an eternity before she finally looked up at his face. The playful smile was gone. His expression was one of raw, unguarded shock, his dark eyes wide, reflecting the same cataclysmic shift she felt inside herself. He was feeling it too. That spark hadn't been her imagination. A line had been crossed. The invisible wall between them had been breached, and they were now standing in a new and terrifyingly intimate territory. He slowly, reluctantly, released his fingers, his warmth lingering on her skin like a brand. He took a half step back, creating a distance that felt both necessary and agonizing. The silence in the library was no longer peaceful. It was a screaming void, filled with everything they wanted to say, everything they couldn't. "Be careful, Alara," he finally murmured, his voice husky. It wasn't clear if he was referring to the ladder or to something infinitely more dangerous. And then he was gone, leaving her alone with the book in her hand and the ghost of his touch burning on her skin. That night, the memory of that simple contact tormented her. At dinner, she couldn't stop herself from watching his hands as he lifted his wineglass, remembering their warmth. When Alistair droned on about the stock market, Alara was lost in a daydream, imagining those same hands touching her waist, her hair, her face. The longing that had been a vague, emotional ache had now crystallized into a sharp, undeniable physical need. It was a craving for his touch that was so intense it made her feel weak, dizzy. Lying in her cold, vast bed later, with Alistair's oblivious snores filling the darkness, she brought her own hand up to her face, pressing her fingers against her lips. She closed her eyes, trying to recapture the feeling, the jolt of life in the quiet library. It was a memory she knew she would replay in her mind 1,000 times. The spark had been struck, and now, alone in the darkness, Alara could feel the first, terrifying flickers of the fire that was to come. The opportunity, when it came, felt like an exhale after holding a breath for far too long. Alistair announced he would be in London for 3 days, a trip to oversee the acquisition of a British shipping firm. The moment the wheels of his private jet left the tarmac, a subtle shift occurred in the mansion's atmosphere. The air grew lighter. The oppressive weight of his presence lifted, and for the first time in months, Alara felt like she could breathe. She and Julian moved through the first day with a careful, deliberate distance, two magnets repelling each other with a force equal to their attraction. They were both acutely aware of the new, dangerous freedom that lay between them. The unspoken tension was a high wire, and they were cautiously walking on opposite ends, terrified of the dizzying fall that would come if they met in the middle. The second night, the sky broke open. A summer thunderstorm rolled in from the coast, a violent, beautiful tempest that rattled the mansion to its ancient foundations. Alara had always been unnerved by storms, and she sat in the dark of her bedroom, watching the lightning split the sky, feeling a kinship with its fury. Then, with a final, deafening crack of thunder that shook the window panes, the house was plunged into absolute blackness. The power was out. The silence that followed was somehow more terrifying than the noise. It was a thick, suffocating blanket, and her heart began to beat a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She was fumbling for her phone on the nightstand when a soft, hesitant knock came at her door. "Alara?" Julian's voice, a low and steady anchor in the disorienting dark. She opened the door to find him standing there, his face illuminated from below by the warm, flickering glow of a single candle. His dark hair was disheveled, and his eyes were filled with a soft concern that made her knees feel weak. "I figured you might be scared," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "I brought a light." He stepped inside, and the vast, opulent bedroom was transformed into an intimate, secret cave. Shadows danced on the walls, making the familiar space feel strange and new. The storm raged on outside, a wild soundtrack to the quiet drama unfolding within. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. She was wrapped in her silk robe, but a chill had settled deep in her bones. "I hate the dark." He placed the candle on a marble-topped dresser and turned to her. In the wavering light, he could see she was shaking. "Hey," he said gently, closing the distance between them. "It's just a storm. It can't get you in here." He reached out, intending only to place a comforting hand on her arm, a simple gesture of reassurance. But the moment his skin touched hers, the spark from the library ignited into a wildfire. It was an inferno. The weeks of stolen glances, of silent conversations, of simmering, suppressed desire erupted in that single point of contact. His hand was so warm, so alive against her cool skin. Her breath hitched. His eyes darkened, his concern melting away into something deeper, something hungrier. Her name was a prayer on his lips. Alara. All pretense of control shattered. He didn't pull her to him. It was a mutual, magnetic collision. His other hand came up to cradle her face, his thumb stroking her cheekbone as his lips found hers. The kiss was not gentle. It was a desperate, frantic claiming, a release of all the words they couldn't speak. It was the taste of rain and longing and rebellion. A small, protesting sound escaped her throat. "Julian, we shouldn't." But the words were a lie, a final, token resistance from a mind that had already surrendered. Her body betrayed her, her hands tangling in his thick hair, pulling him closer, deepening the kiss. Her robe felt suddenly, unbearably heavy. He seemed to sense it, his hands moving from her face down her arms, to the silk tie at her waist. His fingers fumbled with the knot, his own trembling betraying the storm inside him. The robe fell open, pooling at her feet on the floor, leaving her standing before him in nothing but a whisper of white lace, lingerie, and flickering candlelight. He looked at her, his gaze full of a reverent awe that made her feel more beautiful than all of Alistair's diamonds ever had. "You're incredible," he breathed, his voice thick with emotion. He knelt before her, his lips tracing a fiery path down her neck, over her collarbone, to the valley between her breasts. She gasped, her head falling back, her fingers gripping his shoulders. This was a new language, a language of touch and sensation her body had craved without even knowing it. The lace was a fragile barrier he easily bypassed, his warm mouth closing over the peak of one of her full, round breasts. A low moan escaped her, a sound of pure, unadulterated pleasure. The last vestiges of guilt and fear were burned away in the heat of the moment. There was only this, only him. He swept her into his arms and carried her not to the cold marital bed, but down to the thick plush Persian rug in the center of the room. He laid her down gently, the wool soft against her bare back, and came down over her, his body a welcome weight. As the thunder cracked outside, a mirror to the shattering of their resolve, their bodies finally came together in a desperate, almost clumsy union. It was urgent, primal, a frantic exploration of skin and heat and texture. It was the release of 1,000 unspoken conversations, the answer to 1,000,000 silent questions. Julian, oh, Julian. She cried out, her voice raw, her hands tracing the muscles of his back, her nails scraping lightly against his skin. It was not the silent, dutiful endurance she performed for Alistair. This was a fierce, passionate dance, a claiming and a surrendering all at once, and as the climax washed over them, a blinding, beautiful wave, it was not just a physical release. It was a moment of pure, blinding freedom. In the aftermath, they lay tangled on the floor, their breathing slowly returning to normal. The storm outside had begun to pass, the thunder now a distant, gentle rumble. The candle had burned low, casting long, dancing shadows around them. And in the quiet, a new feeling began to settle in their place of passion, the heavy, terrifying, and irrevocable weight of what they had just done. The morning after the storm was unnervingly beautiful. The world outside was washed clean, the sunlight sharp and brilliant on the rain-soaked leaves. Inside the mansion, the power had been restored, and the illusion of perfect, unshakable order had been meticulously put back in place. But for Alara, nothing would ever be the same. The very air she breathed felt different, charged with the memory of the night before. She dressed with trembling hands, her skin still hypersensitive, tingling with the ghost of Julian's touch. She saw him for the first time that day in the grand foyer. He was speaking to a member of the staff, his back to her. At the sound of her footsteps on the marble, he turned. Their eyes met across the vast, sunlit space, and in that single silent moment, an entire universe of shared knowledge passed between them. It was in the slight widening of his eyes, the almost imperceptible smile that touched the corner of his lips. It was in the sudden, hot blush that bloomed on her own cheeks. A contract had been sealed between them, written not in ink, but in sweat and whispers and the shared, shattering release of the storm. They were no longer just two lonely people trapped in the same house. They were co-conspirators, partners in a crime of passion, and the secret they now shared was a living, breathing thing. The secret became their entire world. The mansion, once her prison, was now their playground. Every empty room, every shadowed alcove, every forgotten corridor held a thrilling new promise. Their communication evolved into a clandestine art form. A folded piece of paper tucked into a book she was reading, with a single time and a room number written inside. The brush of his fingers against hers as he passed her a salt shaker at the dinner table, a touch so fleeting Alistair would never notice, but which would send a bolt of lightning straight through her. A shared look over the rim of a wine glass that spoke of things that would make her husband's blood run cold. This new life was a constant, intoxicating dance on the edge of a knife. The fear of discovery was a potent spice that made every stolen moment impossibly, addictively sweet. Ilara found herself feeling more alive than she ever had in her life. She was performing the role of Mrs. Finch with a new, flawless precision, her smile serene, her demeanor perfect, all while her inner world was a raging, joyful tempest of illicit thoughts and memories of Julian. The guilt was there, a low, persistent hum in the back of her mind, a quiet voice that whispered of her father and her broken vows. But the euphoria of her secret life was a roaring symphony that drowned it out. Julian's desire for her was a constant, warming presence. He looked at her not as a beautiful object, but as a magnificent, complex landscape he wanted to explore every inch of. He saw the intelligence in her eyes, the wit in her quiet smile, and the passion she kept so carefully hidden. He was not just her lover, he was her witness. A week after the storm, she found a note inside a gardening magazine. Wine cellar, midnight. The instruction was simple, but it made her heart pound with a fierce, wild rhythm all day. She sat through another one of Alistair's interminable dinners, discussing tax law and polo matches, the secret promise of the night ahead burning like a hot coal inside her. She felt a dizzying sense of power, living this vibrant, secret life right under her keeper's nose. Later, after she had feigned sleep and waited for Alistair's breathing to deepen into its usual rumbling snore, she slipped out of bed. Barefoot and cloaked in a dark silk robe, she moved through the sleeping house like a phantom. The stone steps leading down to the wine cellar were cool against her feet. The air grew damp and chilly, thick with the earthy scent of old wood, cork, and aging grapes. A single, bare bulb illuminated the cavernous space, casting long, eerie shadows from the endless racks of dusty bottles. He was waiting for her at the bottom, leaning against a large oak barrel. This time, there was no hesitation, no uncertainty. The moment she was on the last step, he was there, his arms wrapping around her waist, lifting her effortlessly, his mouth finding hers in a kiss that was deep and sure and hungry. "I've been thinking about this all day," he murmured against her lips. "All week." This time was different from the frantic, desperate coupling during the storm. This was a slow, deliberate, decadent exploration. He led her deeper into the cellar, to a small clearing between the racks. With a confidence that thrilled her, she reached up and began to unbutton his shirt, her fingers brushing against the warm, solid muscle of his chest. He watched her, his eyes dark with a mixture of love and raw desire. He, in turn, slowly untied her robe, letting it fall to the dusty floor. His hands, no longer trembling but steady and sure, began their worship. They traced the elegant curve of her spine, learned the shape of her waist, and cupped the full, heavy weight of her buttocks, pulling her tight against him. "Alara," he whispered, his voice thick, "you feel so good, so perfect." They made love right there, on the cool stone floor, a slow, sensual dance of discovery. Every touch was savored, every kiss was a revelation. It was less about a frantic release and more about an intense, focused pleasure, a greedy cataloging of each other's bodies. He learned the sensitive spot behind her ear, the way she arched her back when he kissed the hollow of her throat. She learned the sound of his sharp intake of breath when she raked her nails lightly down his back. Afterwards, they didn't flee back to their separate rooms. Julian produced a corkscrew and, with a conspiratorial grin, chose a ridiculously expensive bottle of French Bordeaux from Alistair's private collection. They sat together on the floor, passing the bottle back and forth, their naked bodies still humming with the afterglow of their passion. They talked in low whispers, their legs tangled together, sharing stories from their childhoods, their dreams, their fears. In the cool, dark, wine-scented belly of her husband's house, wrapped in her lover's arms, Alara felt for the first time truly, breathtakingly happy. She was drunk on stolen wine and intoxicated by a secret, far more potent. The return of Alistair was like the slow, deliberate turning of a key in a lock. The lightness that had filled the mansion in his absence evaporated, replaced by the familiar, heavy silence of his authority. The servants moved with a new tension, their footsteps softer, their faces more guarded. For Alara, the change was a physical shock, a sudden plunge back into icy water after a brief, warm dream. She had to meticulously rebuild the walls around her heart, brick by painstaking brick, transforming herself back into the serene, untouchable Mrs. Finch. The lover who had whispered secrets in a wine cellar had to be locked away, and the guilt, which had been a quiet hum, now roared back to life with the sound of his car on the gravel driveway. The day after his return, he summoned her to his study. It was a room of dark wood, leather, and the faint, cloying scent of his cigar smoke. It was a room of contracts and power, and she always felt small and insignificant within its walls. He was seated behind his massive desk, a small, velvet-covered box in front of him. He didn't smile as she entered. "Good trip, my dear?" she asked, her voice the perfect pitch of wifely concern. "Profitable," he grunted, his eyes fixed on her. "I closed the deal, and in celebration, I acquired something for you." He slid the box across the polished desk. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened it. Inside, nestled on a bed of black satin, was a necklace. It wasn't a delicate chain or a string of pearls. It was a breathtaking, formidable river of diamonds, cascading down to a central stone the size of a robin's egg. It was ostentatious, impossibly expensive, and utterly cold. "It's beautiful, Alistair," she said, the words feeling like ash in her mouth. "It's a statement," he corrected her, rising from his chair. "It says that my wife is the most well-adorned woman in the state. It says my latest venture was a success." He took the necklace from the box and moved behind her. As he fastened the clasp, the weight of it on her neck was shocking, a physical burden. The diamonds were icy cold against her skin, a stark contrast to the memory of Julian's warm hands. He led her to an ornate mirror, his hands resting on her shoulders, his reflection a grim warden behind her. "You will wear it at the reception on Saturday," he commanded softly. "With the silver gown." She stared at their reflection. She saw a beautiful woman, a prisoner adorned for her captor. The necklace wasn't a gift, it was a collar. Each facet of each diamond seemed to mock her, reflecting the light, reflecting her lies. It was payment for a service she was now rendering under false pretenses, and the guilt was a nauseating, physical thing rising in her throat. The night of the party was a special kind of torture. The silver gown was a sheath of metallic silk, beautiful and cold and confining. With the diamonds blazing at her throat, she felt less like a woman and more like a chandelier, an expensive object designed to light up a room and be admired from a distance. Alistair paraded her through the throngs of guests, his hand a permanent fixture on the small of her back. She smiled, she laughed at jokes she didn't hear, she murmured polite greetings to faces she would never remember. She was a perfect automaton, performing her duties flawlessly. But beneath the placid surface, a frantic search was underway. Her eyes scanned the crowded ballroom over the heads of politicians and banking moguls, desperately seeking the one person who mattered. And then she saw him. He was standing alone by the tall French doors that led to the terrace, a glass of dark liquor in his hand. He wasn't mingling, he was watching her. The noise of the party, the music from the string quartet, the hum of 100 conversations, it all faded into a dull, distant roar. In that moment, there was only the vast, crowded space between them, and his eyes. His gaze held none of the secret delight or shared amusement that had become their language. Tonight, his eyes were dark with a pain that mirrored her own. He saw the gown. He saw the obscenely large diamonds that glittered like frozen tears around her neck. He saw Alistair's hand on her, staking a claim for all the world to see. He was seeing her for what she was in this world, his grandfather's property. And she knew with a devastating certainty that it was hurting him as much as it was hurting her. Their affair was a thing of midnight whispers and stolen moments in shadowed rooms. It could not survive in this bright, unforgiving light. Under the guise of fetching a glass of champagne, she managed to slip away from Alistair's side. She navigated the crowd, her heart pounding, until she reached the relative quiet of the terrace doors where Julian stood. "You look stunning, Alara," he said, his voice low and strained. He didn't say beautiful. He said stunning, like a blow to the head, something that took the breath away by its sheer force. "I feel like I'm in a costume," she whispered back, her hand involuntarily fluttering to the heavy necklace. "I can't breathe." "I know," he said, his gaze dropping to the diamonds. "He's branded you." The word hung in the air between them, ugly and true. Before she could reply, Alistair's voice boomed from across the room. "Alara, darling, the Mortons are just leaving. Come say goodbye." She gave Julian one last, desperate look, her eyes pleading for an understanding he had already given her, and then she turned, the perfect wife once more, and glided back to her husband's side. The worst moment came during the dancing. Alistair, in a rare show of public affection, led her to the center of the floor for a waltz. As he spun her around the room under the glittering chandeliers, she felt dizzy and sick. His grip was firm, his steps precise. She moved with him, her body pliant, her face a mask of contentment, but her eyes were fixed over his shoulder, locked on Julian, who stood motionless by the doors, watching them. The dance was a perfect metaphor for her life. She was trapped in an elegant public embrace with one man, while her heart, her soul, her entire being yearned for another who could only watch from the shadows. That night, after the last guest had departed, she stood in her silent bedroom and unclasped the diamond necklace. It came off with a sigh of relief, like a held breath finally released. It left angry red marks on her skin, cold and heavy reminders of her gilded cage. She let it fall from her fingers onto the vanity, where it lay coiled and glittering like a beautiful dead snake. The intoxicating thrill of her secret was gone, replaced by the bitter, metallic taste of guilt and the cold, hard reality of her choices. She was living two lives, and she was beginning to fear, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that she was about to lose them both. The party left a scar. In the days that followed, a cold, quiet despair settled over Alara. The brief, intoxicating joy of the affair had been tainted by the public spectacle of her bondage. She and Julian exchanged the same furtive glances, but now they were laced with a shared sorrow, a new awareness of the chasm that separated his world of quiet rebellion from her world of glittering servitude. The mansion felt smaller, the walls closer, the air thinner. It was Julian who broke the silence. He found her in the glass conservatory, where she was listlessly staring at a collection of orchids, each one a perfect, captive beauty. "I can't watch this," he said, his voice raw with an urgency that startled her. "I can't watch you disappear. We have to get out of here." "Get out?" She laughed, a bitter, hopeless sound. "Where would we go, Julian? And for how long? An hour?" "Yes," he said, his eyes burning with intensity. "For an hour, for an afternoon, just to breathe air that isn't owned by him, to stand in a place where you are not Mrs. Finch, just a Lara." The plan was simple, and that's what made it so terrifyingly audacious. Alara informed Alistair's ever-present personal assistant that she would be attending a charity luncheon planning meeting in the coastal town of Southport, a perfectly plausible excuse. Julian, meanwhile, announced he was driving into New Haven for specialty canvases. They would take their own cars. They would not leave together. The morning of their escape, Alara's stomach was a knot of exhilarating fear. She dressed the part of the society wife in a tasteful linen dress and low heels, her purse and keys in hand. As she drove her pristine Mercedes down the long, winding driveway, she felt the oppressive weight of the estate begin to lift. Watching the massive iron gates swing shut in her rearview mirror was a moment of pure, terrifying liberation. She met him at a dusty, scenic overlook on the coastal highway. His car, a slightly battered but classic convertible, was parked waiting for her. The moment she stepped out of her air-conditioned cage and into the warm, salt-laced air, he was there. He didn't speak. He just wrapped his arms around her and held her, and she buried her face in his shoulder, inhaling the scent of him, the scent of freedom. They abandoned her car and drove off in his, the top down, the wind whipping through her perfectly styled hair, tearing it from its pins, and for the first time in a year, she laughed, a real, unrestrained, joyful sound. He took her to a small, windswept beach that was nearly deserted. She slipped off her expensive heels and walked barefoot on the sand, the grains warm and coarse between her toes. For the first time, in the bright, open sunlight, he took her hand, his fingers lacing through hers. It was a simple, normal gesture, but for them, it was a revolution. They were a couple. Here, in this anonymous stretch of sand and sea, they were just a man and a woman holding hands, their secret worlds spilling out into the real one. They walked for what felt like hours, not talking much, simply existing together in this bubble of freedom. They bought fried clams and ice cream from a weather-beaten shack on the boardwalk and sat on a bench, their shoulders touching. She ate with a ravenous appetite she hadn't felt in months, laughing as a smear of chocolate got on her nose, and he gently wiped it away with his thumb. No one knew her here. No one stared. She was not a possession. She was just Alara. As the afternoon sun began its slow descent, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, the joyful lightness between them shifted into a deeper, more profound intimacy. The freedom they felt in public only intensified their craving for privacy, a space that was truly, completely theirs. He looked at her, his eyes full of a love that was so open and vulnerable it made her ache. "I don't want to take you back yet," he said, his voice soft. He gestured with his head towards a small, unassuming motel just off the beach, its neon sign a faded pink against the twilight. The Sea Spray Inn. It was simple, a little worn, and utterly perfect. The room was anonymous, furnished with a sturdy bed and a cheap landscape painting on the wall. It smelled faintly of salt and clean linens. But to Alara, it was the most beautiful place on earth. Here, there were no expectations, no performances, no Alistair. As the golden hour light streamed through the thin curtains, Julian led her to the bed. This time was different. It wasn't the frantic desperation of the storm, nor the decadent sensuality of the wine cellar. This was an act of pure love. He began by kissing the place on her neck where the diamonds had rested, his touch gentle, as if he were healing a wound. He undressed her slowly, reverently, his eyes worshipping every inch of her. In the warm, natural light, there were no shadows to hide in. He saw all of her, the faint lines of stress around her eyes, a small scar on her knee from a childhood fall, and his gaze was filled with nothing but adoration. He made love to her with a tenderness that unraveled her completely. It was slow and deep and breathtakingly emotional. It was a conversation between two souls who had finally found their language. He held her face in his hands, looking deep into her eyes as they moved together, and in that moment of absolute connection, as she felt a wave of love so powerful it threatened to break her apart, he whispered the words that changed everything. "Alara, my Alara, I love you." A single tear escaped her eye and traced a path down her temple. It wasn't a tear of sadness, but of a joy so profound and a sorrow so deep they had become the same emotion. She loved him too, with every broken piece of her being, and that love was both her salvation and her damnation. The drive back was silent, each in their separate cars, the sun setting on their perfect, stolen day. As Alara guided her Mercedes back up the long driveway, the mansion loomed before her, a palace of shadows. She drove back through the iron gates, a willing prisoner returning to her cell, but something was different now. The cage was the same, but the woman inside it had been irrevocably changed. She was no longer just a keeper of a passionate secret. She was the keeper of a love so real and so powerful. It would either give her the strength to break free, or it would be the one thing that would ultimately destroy her. Their perfect day at the sea had been a powerful anesthetic, numbing them to the constant underlying danger of their situation. The declaration of love had emboldened them, making them feel as though their bond was a sacred, invisible shield. Back within the mansion's walls, this newfound confidence bred a dangerous carelessness. They began to take small, foolish risks, intoxicated by their own audacity. A lingering touch in a hallway when they thought the staff had passed, a deep, meaningful look held for a second too long across the dinner table. Each successful transgression made them feel more invincible. They had built a beautiful, fragile world for themselves within the gilded cage, and they had started to believe its walls were real. The mistake happened on a bright, deceptively peaceful afternoon. Alistair was supposedly locked in board meetings in the city until late in the evening. The house was quiet, the staff moving with the hushed efficiency of a well-oiled machine. Julian found Alara in the east sunroom, a beautiful, glass-walled space filled with exotic plants and comfortable wicker furniture. It was her favorite room, a bubble of warmth and life, but its very openness made it a terribly dangerous place for a secret. Lulled into a false sense of security, they didn't care. The sunlight streamed in, warming their skin as she lay with her head in his lap on a long chaise lounge. He was reading to her, his voice a low, melodic murmur, the words of a forbidden poem weaving a spell around them. She had her eyes closed, her hand resting over his heart, feeling its steady, reassuring beat. It was a moment of such perfect, simple domesticity that it felt almost normal, a heart-wrenching glimpse of a life they could never have. He leaned down and kissed her, a long, slow, tender kiss full of all the love they couldn't express. It was in the middle of this perfect, stolen moment that the sound reached them. At first, it was just a faint crunch of tires on the gravel of the main driveway, a sound they dismissed as a delivery or a gardener's truck. But then came the unmistakable heavy slam of a limousine door, a sound that carried with it the weight of absolute authority. And then, the final, fatal blow, Alistair's voice, not distant but sharp and clear from the main foyer, booming a greeting to the butler. "Hollis, my last meeting was postponed. I decided to come home early." The world shattered. Their eyes met in a silent scream of pure, unadulterated terror. For a frozen second, they were paralyzed, two deer caught in the blinding headlights of an oncoming truck. Then, adrenaline, cold and sharp, flooded their veins. It was a frantic, silent ballet of panic. They scrambled apart, their limbs clumsy with haste. Julian was on his feet in an instant, his face pale, his eyes wide with a fear that was entirely for her. He smoothed down his shirt, ran a hand through his hair, and gave her one last, desperate look. "The side door," she mouthed, her voice stolen by panic. He nodded, and with the silent grace of a shadow, slipped out of the sunroom through the French door that led to the gardens, disappearing behind a wall of overgrown ivy. Alara was left alone, her heart hammering against her ribs so violently she thought it might break through. Her hands were shaking uncontrollably. Her breath was coming in ragged, shallow gasps. She looked around the room, her mind racing. The book of poetry lay open on the floor, She snatched it and shoved it deep between the cushions of the lounge. Her hair was a mess from his fingers. She tried to smooth it, her trembling hands making it worse. Her dress was rumpled. She stood up, forcing herself to take a deep, shuddering breath just as the main door to the sunroom swung open. Alistair stood there, immaculate in his dark suit, his silver hair perfectly in place. He surveyed the room with his cold, possessive eyes, and then they settled on her. The silence stretched for an eternity. He saw everything. He missed nothing. "Hello, my dear," he said, his voice deceptively mild. "Enjoying the afternoon sun?" "Alistair," she managed, her voice a strained whisper. She cleared her throat, forcing a smile. "You're home early. I wasn't expecting you." "Evidently," he said, taking a slow step into the room. He ran a finger along a dusty leaf of a large fern. "I thought I heard voices just now." The floor seemed to drop out from under her. "No," she said, her voice miraculously steady. "No, it was just me. Reading aloud sometimes. A silly habit." He stopped in front of her, his eyes narrowing slightly. He was too close. She was sure he could hear the frantic trip hammer of her heart. "You look flushed, Alara," he observed, his gaze analytical. "And you're breathing as though you've just run a race." "It's just the heat in here," she lied, gesturing vaguely at the glass walls. "It can get quite stuffy." He seemed to consider her answer, his expression unreadable. For a terrifying moment, she was certain he knew. She thought he would reach out, find the still warm indentation on the cushion next to her, and her world would end. But instead, he simply nodded. "Perhaps. I'm going to my study to make some calls." He turned and walked out, leaving her standing alone in the sun-drenched room, which now felt as cold and terrifying as a tomb. The moment the door clicked shut, her legs gave out. She sank onto the chaise lounge, wrapping her arms around herself as a violent, uncontrollable tremor shook her entire body. The adrenaline drained away, leaving a sick, icy dread in its place. They had almost been caught. The image of Alistair's face, the cold suspicion in his eyes, was burned into her mind. This wasn't a game. This wasn't a thrilling secret. This was a mortal danger. Later that night, in the deepest dark, they met in a small, musty linen closet on the 3rd floor. There was no passion, no tenderness. The air was thick with fear. Julian reached for her in the dark, and his hands were as cold as hers. "He knows," she whispered, her voice cracking. "He didn't say anything, but I saw it in his eyes. He knows something is wrong. We have to be more careful." Julian breathed back, his voice strained. "Alara, what he would do. Not to me. I don't care about that. But to you. To your father. We were so stupid." The reality of Alistair's power, of his capacity for cold, calculated cruelty, had come crashing back down on them. Their love, which had felt like an impenetrable fortress on that sun-drenched beach, now felt like a fragile house of glass, and the executioner's stone was already in his hand. They parted not with a kiss, but with a shared look of utter terror. The beautiful, intoxicating affair was over. In its place was a desperate, panicked conspiracy, and they were no longer just lovers, but fugitives in their own home, listening for the footsteps on the stairs, waiting for the axe to fall. The close call in the sunroom was not an ending, but a beginning. It was the beginning of a cold war, a campaign of psychological terror waged by a master of the craft. Alistair never raised his voice, never accused them of anything. He did something far worse. He became pleasant. He was attentive, almost doting, in a way that made Alara's skin crawl. The air in the mansion, once heavy with oppressive silence, was now thick with a cloying, menacing calm. The game had changed, and the thrill of their secret was replaced by the cold, metallic taste of pure dread. At the dinner table, Alistair would tell stories, his voice casual as he dissected his filet mignon. He spoke of a young, ambitious executive at one of his companies who had tried to discreetly sell trade secrets to a competitor. "It was a shame," Alistair mused, dabbing his lips with a linen napkin, his cold eyes flitting between Alara and Julian. He had a promising future, but loyalty is the bedrock of any successful enterprise. Once that foundation is cracked, the entire structure is compromised. It must be demolished. He would then smile, a thin, bloodless stretching of his lips, and ask Alara to pass the salt. They would sit there, frozen, the unspoken threat hanging over the table like a guillotine. They didn't dare look at each other, for fear their shared terror would be as obvious as a scream. The mansion, which had once been their secret playground, became a panopticon. Alara began to feel a constant prickling sensation on the back of her neck, the undeniable feeling of being watched. The maid, Maria, who had once been a ghost, now seemed to materialize in every room Alara entered, silently polishing a table or adjusting a curtain, her presence a constant, quiet surveillance. A gardener would be trimming the hedges directly outside the library window for an entire afternoon. Were these Alistair's orders, or was she descending into paranoia? The uncertainty was a torment in itself. Alistair began to methodically, surgically separate them. He announced that Julian, with his artistic eye, was now responsible for overseeing the tedious restoration of a remote hunting lodge the family owned in upstate New York. It was a pointless, punishing assignment designed to keep him away from the estate for days, sometimes a week at a time. During Julian's forced absences, Alistair tightened his grip on Alara. He canceled her charity meetings and shopping trips, insisting she accompany him everywhere. She was his constant shadow, from business lunches where she'd sit in silence, to evenings at the symphony where his hand would rest on her knee, a gesture that felt less like affection and more like ownership. He was isolating her, cutting her off from her only ally, reminding her that she was his and his alone. The nights were the worst. Lying next to Alistair's sleeping form, she would stare into the darkness, her mind a frantic carousel of what-ifs. The memory of Julian's love, which had been her salvation, now felt like a liability, a weakness that Alistair could exploit to destroy them all. When Julian did return to the mansion, he was a ghost of his former self. The rebellious spark in his eyes had been extinguished, replaced by a haunted, weary look. The joy was gone. Their love, which had bloomed so beautifully in secret, began to wither under the constant, unblinking glare of Alistair's suspicion. They managed to meet one last time, in the dead of night, on a cold, stone bench at the farthest end of the garden. The romance was gone, replaced by a desperate, frantic need to strategize. The air was cold, and their whispers were snatched away by the wind. "This has to stop, Alara," Julian said, his voice ragged. He wouldn't even touch her, as if he feared a listening device was planted in the very soil beneath their feet. "It's not a game anymore. He's toying with us. He's enjoying this. I have to leave." "Leave?" The word was a knife in her heart. "Go where?" "Away. Back to Europe. Anywhere. If I'm gone, he has no leverage. He'll have no reason to watch you, to torment you. He'll win his little prize, and you'll be safe." "Safe?" She choked out a laugh that was half a sob. "I'll be alone, Julian. I'll go back to being dead. It's better than what he'll do to you if he gets the proof he's looking for," he insisted, his voice cracking with a pain that mirrored her own. "He'll destroy your father. He'll lock you away. Alara, I love you. And because I love you, I have to go." They stared at each other in the darkness, two souls trapped in an impossible checkmate. There was no way out. There was no happy ending. There was only the cold, hard reality of the power one old man held over both their lives. The unraveling was complete. It culminated not with a bang, but with a quiet, terrifying moment of absolute certainty. The night after her final, desperate conversation with Julian, Alara was in the library, unable to sleep. She was standing by the window, looking out at the dark, menacing shapes of the garden, when the door opened. It was Alistair. He was in his dressing gown, a glass of brandy in his hand. He didn't speak at first, simply walking over to the fireplace. He swirled the amber liquid, his expression calm, contemplative. "You seem troubled lately, my dear," he said, his voice a low, almost gentle rumble. She didn't answer. Her heart was a cold, heavy stone in her chest. He took a sip of his brandy. Then, he reached into the pocket of his gown and pulled something out. It was the slim volume of Mary Oliver's poetry. Her blood ran cold. She had hidden it. She was sure of it, hidden it so well. "I found this in your bedside table," he said, his voice still unnervingly calm. He opened it, his thumb flicking through the pages as if it were a common ledger, a rather sentimental choice, full of talk about the wildness of nature, about freedom. He stopped, his eyes lifting from the page to meet hers, and in his gaze, she saw it all. The pretense was over. There was no more suspicion. There was only the cold, absolute certainty of a predator who had finally cornered his prey. He smiled that thin, bloodless smile. "Don't look so frightened, Alara. The chaos is over. I'm about to fix everything." Alistair did not raise his voice. He simply placed the book of poetry on the mantelpiece with a soft, final thud. The sound echoed the closing of a coffin lid. He gestured towards the leather armchair opposite his own. "Sit down, Alara." It was not a request. It was the calm, quiet command of a man whose victory was so absolute, he had no need for anger. She moved with the stiff, jerky motions of a marionette, her legs numb, and sank into the chair. He sat down opposite her, swirling the last of the brandy in his glass. "I am not an unreasonable man," he began, his voice a low, chillingly rational purr. "I believe in contracts, in cause and effect. An action is taken, and a consequence follows. It is the fundamental principle of business and of life." He reached into a drawer of his desk and pulled out a simple manila envelope, tossing it onto the coffee table between them. It landed with a soft, heavy slap. "Your actions," he said, his eyes like chips of ice, "have necessitated a rather significant consequence." With a trembling hand, she reached for the envelope. Inside were photographs. Not grainy, long-distance shots, but sharp, clear, glossy prints. Her and Julian on the beach, laughing, his arm around her shoulders. Her and Julian sharing an ice cream cone, their faces so close, their smiles so genuine, so full of a life she no longer had. And the last one, the most damning of all, a picture of them standing outside the Sea Spray Inn, her hand in his, their faces alight with the love that had now become her death sentence. There was no defense. There was nothing to say. The fight, the hope, the rebellion, it all drained out of her, leaving an empty, hollow vessel. At that moment, the door to the study opened, and Hollis the butler showed Julian in. "You wish to see me, grandfather?" Julian began, and then he saw Alara's pale, stricken face, and the photographs spread across the table. All the color drained from his own face. He understood instantly. He had been summoned not for a conversation, but for a sentencing. "Julian," Alistair said with that same terrifying calm, "I'm a great believer in family, but a cancerous limb must be amputated to save the body." He rose and stood before the fireplace, a judge about to deliver his verdict. "First," he said, looking at Alara, "there will be no divorce. A Finch does not fail. This family, this marriage, will remain intact. You will continue your duties as my wife. The deal I made with your father will be honored, as long as you continue to honor your side of the bargain." He then turned his full, frigid attention to Julian. "You, however, are a different matter. You have committed the cardinal sin. You did not merely betray me, you betrayed your own blood. You attempted to steal what is mine. Therefore, you are no longer a beneficiary of this family. Your trust fund is dissolved. Your inheritance is nullified. You will be removed from the board of all family holdings." Julian stood there, taking it, his jaw tight, his fists clenched. "And as for your future," Alistair continued, "I am not so cruel as to leave you with nothing. I am giving you a new responsibility. You will be the new general manager of our most remote processing facility in Prudhoe Bay, Alaska. You will leave tomorrow morning. A car will be here at 6 a.m. Your communication will be monitored. You will not contact Alara. You will not return here unless summoned. You will do your job, and perhaps, in a decade or two, you will have contemplated the true cost of your foolish romantic notions." The sentence was absolute. It was not a punishment of rage, but of cold, logistical cruelty. It was a living death, an exile to a frozen wasteland, under his grandfather's complete and total control. "Now," Alistair said, sinking back into his chair and taking a sip of his brandy, "you have 5 minutes. Say your goodbyes." He watched them, a connoisseur of suffering, as they stood frozen in the center of the room. What could they say? What words were there for this kind of evisceration? Julian finally took a step towards her, his face a mask of agony and self-loathing. "Alara," he whispered, his voice broken, "I'm so sorry." "Don't be," she whispered back, a single tear finally escaping, tracing a cold path down her cheek. "It was the only time I was ever alive." He reached out, as if to touch her face one last time, but he stopped himself, his hand falling to his side. He knew Alistair was watching, savoring this. To touch her now would be to give the old man more of what he wanted. So he just looked at her, his eyes trying to memorize her face, to communicate a lifetime of love and regret in one final, silent gaze. And then he turned and walked out of the room, out of the house, and out of her life. Months passed, the seasons changed, but inside the Finch mansion, time stood still. Alara was the perfect wife. She was beautiful, poised, and utterly silent. The fire in her had been extinguished, leaving behind only the delicate, empty shell of the woman she once was. She attended the parties, wore the diamonds, and smiled her serene, vacant smile. She was Alistair's greatest triumph, a wild thing he had not only caged, but completely and utterly broken. Her victory was that she felt nothing. The pain was so vast, so complete, that it had become a kind of peace, the quiet peace of a battlefield after the war is over and everyone is dead. One crisp autumn morning, she stood in the opulent marble bathroom, just as she had all those months ago. She stared at her own reflection in the gilded mirror. She was pale, her eyes large and shadowed, but there was a new change, a subtle, almost imperceptible shift in her body. Her hand, as if with a mind of its own, moved down to rest on the flat plane of her stomach. A new life was growing inside of her, a secret she had only just confirmed. And as she stared at the haunted, unfamiliar woman in the mirror, the final, most perfect, most cruel aspect of Alistair's punishment became clear. Her prison was no longer just the mansion, it was now her own body. She would carry this child, and for the rest of her life, she would look into its eyes, and she would never, ever know. Was it the legitimate heir to the Finch empire, conceived in duty and darkness? Or was it the last, living remnant of a love born in sunlight and whispers, a love that had cost her everything? The question would be her new warden, her new cage, a sentence with no hope of parole for the rest of her days.